I went on a trek one time to East Africa with HBS. It was a tour guide, I believe was a guide for all the top 10 MBA. And he said that I've done this for so many years, I can tell without anybody mentioning that they're from HBS, I can tell that they're from HBS. And I said, how's that? He said, all the other programs.
Very excited to have you here for this coffee chat, Ehsan. Can you kick things off by introducing yourself, telling us where you got your MBA, when was that, and kind of like what you are doing today?
Sure, be happy to, and thank you for having me, Mike. So my name is Ehsan. I'm started out originally from Detroit, Michigan. I'm an engineer, bachelor's and master's in industrial engineering from University of Michigan. About 6 years pre-MBA in the automotive industry, 5 with General Motors, a variety of operational roles, and then a year with an automotive startup companies that was competing neck and neck with Tesla. At that point in time, backed by Kleiner Perkins, unfortunately, it went bust. Went to HBS, graduated in 2011, and then joined Siemens in an executive leadership rotational program for 5 years. 3 of which was the rotational program, working directly for the global CEO, hired and interviewed by him, working on change transformation projects 1 year apiece. And then if you did that well, they would give you a P&L to manage. Managed about a 20 million P&L for Siemens Fire and Security. And then I transitioned into private equity because I enjoyed the change, the transformation aspect of helping organizations. And so I spent some time at Platinum Equity and one of their portfolio companies, and then afterwards ran a search fund for about a few years. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. I was doing ops consulting during that. It didn't work out, but I learned a lot of lessons. Some of those lessons in software that I wrote is actually a startup that I'm working on right now while being an interim COO to a PE-backed portfolio company. So that's a little bit about me and where I am. And sort of the first half of my career, I would say it was more ops and sales. And the last half was more private equity from an industry function, but from a functional perspective, still ops and sales, as well.
No, great. Thanks for that background. And yeah, I guess we're talking to, this for the purpose of this conversation is to share some insights. I guess for you, it's like 13 years post MBA for folks who are, maybe they're in their MBA program, maybe they're just starting to think about and question if an MBA is something that they want to pursue, because a lot of time and investment goes into it, as you know. But before we jump into your experiences more recently and that sort of thing, could I just ask you, when you were applying to your MBA program, you had, I think you said 5 or 6 years of experience already, more on the ops side. Why did you pursue an MBA?
I pursued an MBA because I felt that while at General Motors, I felt that leaders that were in very senior roles had MBAs. And at that moment in time, back in the 80s, 90s, GM had sponsored several high-performing executives at MIT, at HBS. But when I was there in, you call it late 2000s, so 2000, sort of, just before the crash, so 2003 to 2009, I felt that there were fewer sort of top 10 MBAs, and I felt that would dramatically distinguish myself. So, and frankly, I was just inquisitive to learn more about the world, and I'd always been interested in business, and I thought this would be a great experience to, round out my career.
Totally. Makes sense. Cool. And so I guess now that you're, a decade post MBA, you've had, you had a couple different careers, I guess, even pre-MBA, but now you've had a couple careers probably since then, and you still have a couple left in you, I think, before it's all said and done. So you've done a bunch of things. You have a ton of insights. If you were, as you're thinking about, the intended audience here for this conversation, specifically, I think those folks that might be engineers like you are, like you were, like you've been, what advice would you give to engineers that are thinking about pursuing an MBA? This advice can probably apply to anyone, but specifically engineers, given that that's been your experience.
Yeah, a few. One is I think engineers naturally tend to be somewhat similar to doctors or lawyers. They tend to be risk averse. They tend to be more conservative in nature. They tend to see the world more black and white. They tend to be trained to identify risk. And as such, because of the way that they have been taught to see the world in black and white, I think, number one, I believe being an engineer is something that the U.S. needs more of. And I think it dramatically makes you stand out and have instant sort of credibility that's a little bit different than the mainstream of folks that are coming into business school. So I believe that if you coming into business school, I think if you have a better understanding of yourself, I go back to my first day, and I remember about going to Spangler Auditorium, and about 300 students were there. This was first day or perhaps the orientation, and Tim Butler asked, how many of you know exactly what you want to do post-MBA? And the room must have been about 300 MBA students. And I believe, I could be wrong, but somewhere between no more than 3 to 6 people raised their hand. Like literally no more. And it was evident to me that, all right, folks are coming in, they don't quite know what they want to do, and perhaps that's okay. And then I remember being in 2 years afterwards, being in the same Spangler Auditorium where Tim then asked the same question. Now that you have completed your MBA or about to complete, how many of you know exactly what you want to do after HBS? And I swear it couldn't have been more than probably a dozen. Like in the sense that pre and post, it was literally the same amount of people were as indecisive about their career as post MBA. And it was very surprising to me, frankly. And I feel that most folks, one of the reasons that people value or are drawn to an MBA is to see the outside world and to be not only for the education, but for the relationships. But I do believe it's extremely important that you walk into business school having a good reflection on who you are, what interests you, what you're passionate about. And I know that sounds cliche, but even if you don't know necessarily your passion, that's okay. I think being able to pick certain areas where you think your passion lies and being able to iterate, do rapid prototyping, fail fast if necessary, and use business school or even pre-business school, depending on where you are, being able to understand better who you are, what your strengths is, and iterate, be it, you could iterate during your gap year or spend some time job shadowing or speaking with folks where you believe could be a career for you, and self-reflecting on, does that fit you? Does that fit your values? Does that fit your principles? Be true to yourself as opposed to chasing the economics of hedge fund or private equity, because it is a double-edged sword in the sense that there could be certain areas and aspects of, for example, hedge fund or private equity that you may not enjoy. And so to the extent that you could actually figure out what you do enjoy sooner and faster, and then use the MBA experience to close doors. I know it's extremely difficult, but being at HBS, you're drawn to so much. You have so much talent that it will never replicate. That bubble will never replicate itself in
Yep.
your life. And to the extent that you
Yeah.
could actually leverage those experiences and close certain doors, as Michael Porter says, strategy is more about closing doors than opening doors. And being able to pick the few areas, I think that it will dramatically give you a head start post-MBA.
Totally. What you just described, like trying to, you got to put a stake in the ground in a sense
Exactly.
of like what you think you're passionate about, and
Correct.
go figure that out. Close that door quickly if you learn that, or if it's a door you want to continue walking through, pursue that. For me personally, that work didn't start for me as a person until the application process. That's a little embarrassing to think about, but I had never asked myself like, what am I passionate about? What do I care about? What do I like doing? Prior to the MBA application process. So I have that to be thankful for. But prior to that, I just did what everyone else thought was important to do, what the highest paying job I could get was, what the most prestigious job was. And I don't regret those decisions. It's worked out just fine. But it is important at some point to take a step back, like you're saying, think about what you actually care about and pursue that, because that is a meaningful path worth paving. And for me, that started the MBA application. When you described, Ehsan, you described the three people in your class at HBS that had a sense for what they wanted to do. They raised their hand in the auditorium. 2 years later, it's like 12 people. Startups would say 4x growth. But I think what you're saying is really no one, it's not a lot of people, right? Where did you fall on that spectrum? Did you go in knowing like, hey, this is what I'm trying to do with my career, and like being very intentional about proving or disproving those hypotheses? Or did you find yourself somewhere in the middle trying to figure out on the go while you're in business school?
I was a diehard auto guy, and there was very few of us in my class. And interesting side note, in the sort of 80s and 90s, I believe it was the automotive industry represented what consulting represents in the incoming class. So you had more folks from the auto industry and the manufacturing industry back in the 80s and 90s than you did consultants. And then now, back when you and I went to school, it completely flipped the opposite direction, almost to the tune where out of 900, there were only three from the
Wow.
automotive industry. I would say I was always interested to continue that path and or be essentially in an engineering multinational company, which is why I ended up at Siemens. But much like what you said, I believe that I didn't put a stake in the ground because I felt like if you put a stake in the ground that it would somehow define, or you put established roots, it would somehow close certain doors. And therefore, I feel like people go throughout their MBA program not wanting to make that decision, or simply delaying that decision of establishing roots or planting the flag, to use your analogy. And so as a result, they'll sort of de-risk that and go to banking or consulting because they'll just delay that decision. And I think you're absolutely right. I think if you can make that decision sooner and not be worried about the replications of it, instead of following sort of a herd mentality, I think will dramatically benefit you.
Yeah, I agree. Easier said than done, I think, right? Especially
Much
when
easier.
you're early in your career, right? You really want to, a lot of times we're optimizing for optionality. And
Correct.
so that's a
And
big part of
social
why,
stigma.
and social stigma, totally.
Yeah.
Yes. Those are two of the reasons why, those are two of the driving factors between a lot of my early career decisions. So I can relate to those two things for sure. You mentioned you're one of the few in your class that was into the auto space. Probably one of the few engineers too. So thinking about for all the engineers out there that are exploring MBAs and that sort of thing, is there anything that you, while you're in your MBA program, so I'm asking you to go back like a long time now, but would have liked to focus on more, or what would you have changed about your approach to business school if you were able to go back today? Is there anything like that?
Yeah, great question. A few things come to mind in no order of priority. One is post-business school, I would not have chosen rotational program. In fact, I don't believe in rotational programs, period. I think the reason for that is, Danaher has it, Siemens has it, GE has it, et cetera. And the reason for that is, frankly, there is no ownership that you have. So you'll get experience for 6, 8, 12 months in a specific role, and then you move on. What the organization, though, values that I have seen in my experience, is they value depth of knowledge, and they value sort of that depth of functional knowledge. And it does help give you exposure to different functions if you're truly unfamiliar with perhaps functions that you are looking to break into from that you didn't have experience pre-MBA. So if you are a functional switcher, I think it may be an avenue, but the risk always with rotational programs is when you do several rotations and you graduate after 2 or 3 years, there is no one person that actually has your sponsorship and ownership and the best interest of you in mind, that when you graduate, they will give you a promotion from thereafter. You could view it differently. You could also view it from the standpoint of, if a CEO is looking to promote someone, would they promote someone that has done 3 rotations over 3 years, or would they promote someone that has consistently been there in their organization for 10, 15 years, working hard and diligently? Would they knock essentially that person off the ladder and have you take that role? And that, I find it that almost always a hiring manager will choose functional depth and expertise, and in particular folks that they're familiar with, versus someone that has done sort of a multifunctional rotational program. So that would be my take
Interesting.
on rotational programs. The
That
second would,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, I've never heard that take before, because I've only thought of and heard about leadership, like leadership development programs, leadership rotational programs, as a coveted opportunity to have really great exposure, visibility to executive leadership teams, and then fast track to owning a P&L. But I think what you're saying is being in-house, having done one of these before, gone through a program, but also just worked within different organizations throughout your career. It's the depth of expertise. When you're later down your road, when you're being considered for leadership roles, it's the depth of your expertise, more so than the breadth of your expertise that's going to help you be successful in a leadership capacity. I think that's what you're saying, and that makes sense to me. It's interesting. I've never heard anyone speak. It sounds like you're short on leadership development programs. I've never heard anyone share a take like that before. It's very thought provoking.
I think it's great in your 20s when you're still exploring, to your point. But in your 30s, I think it's extremely important that you focus on that, establishing that depth, both in terms of function and in terms of industry, and it versus delaying that decision and optimizing on optionality. And so, to the extent I often find when I look at peers that are truly experts in their specific field, they have planted their flag and root in a specific function or industry sooner than anyone else. In other words, they knew, right or wrong, they knew what they wanted to do. And if it was wrong, then they pivoted multiple times, and that's perfectly fine. And oftentimes they did, but at least they took the risk, and they had the courage to plant their flag and make that decision. I agree. Certainly much harder than easier said than done. But the other reason, frankly, for rotational programs is that it's extremely important to, when you make decisions, to see the implication and implementation of those decisions. And so you can't have that benefit and that experience of exercising that muscle in 6 to 8 month rotation. You have to be able to specifically be in that role for minimum 18 to 24 months to be able to
Totally,
see
I
that
can
through.
relate to that with my consulting experience. I think this is a experience shared by anyone who's doing a project-based role, where you parachute in and then you get pulled out a few months later. So
That's
all the
right.
consultants and future consultants out there, this is the nature of the role. It was one of the challenges I had with consulting. I by and far I largely really enjoyed my consulting experience, and I do value it a ton. But the one challenge with it for me was you couldn't see things through. You'd make recommendations, and maybe you work on some implementation projects, but you don't really, it takes months and years to see the impact of the work you do. And I think everything moves a little bit more slowly than one thinks. So from idea conception to implementation to results, it takes years. And that part is missing when you're rotating across different organizations within a company, or when you're working as a consultant or some kind of like fractional role like that.
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. The other point maybe to provide would be maybe just a couple points. One is, at least from an engineering mindset, I felt the curriculum was perhaps more important than relationships that I would be forming or idea generation and sort of using HBS or your MBA as an incubator for trial and error of different ideas that you may have. And if I were to rewind the clock, I would have definitely focused more on developing stronger and more meaningful relationships, and finding those, let's say, no more than, it's interesting, post MBA, you keep in touch with, say, I don't know, 10 to 20 folks. That number will quickly diminish by 10 years post MBA to no more than 3 to 5. And for that reason, in terms of a meaningful relationship. And so I think, to use your word again, optionality, I think folks tend to want to be friends with everyone. I think it's certainly okay not to be friends with everyone, and find out who you share the same passion and interests, share the same values and principles, and so you can establish sort of longer, meaningful relationships while at school. The second would be personal finance, and one thing that I wish I knew earlier would be, how do I manage money better? I think most people, at least most of my friends that I've seen, they work extremely hard. They're so career oriented. They oftentimes forget to put their money to work, put all their savings to work. And whether it be in real estate or whether it be in other aspects of using that money, I think that's extremely important to be able to, an understanding of what the options are with related to personal finance, and being able to understand how you can manage your money better, manage your time better, manage certain relationships better, I think would be extremely helpful. And the third, I feel engineers oftentimes, because they see the world in black and white, I think it's extremely important that they also spend time in terms of getting comfortable around communication. I was shy in terms of raising my hand and participating in class, and back then 50% was of your grade was participation. HBS truly brought me out of my shell. I did 4 years of acting in college. That definitely helped convert me from an introvert to an extrovert. But more importantly, I think it's being able to have an opinion, build on other people's perspectives, or disagree with other people's perspectives. I didn't realize fully how important and how much many decisions are made in meetings. Perhaps I was a bit naive and sheltered as an engineer at General Motors, but it was eye-opening for me. And so communication and being able to exercise that, especially for leadership roles later on, is extremely important for engineers that it's just simply underutilized.
Yeah, I think those are really, really great points. I want to go back. I want to hit on all of them, but I had questions about them. But the idea about personal finance being taught in business school, I think it's interesting. That made me think about like what you and I have talked about before. Like you called it. You've coined this like the CEO of yourself, or CEO of self. Is that
Right.
how you think about it? That should be like a class. If that were a class at HBS, right? Like, what would the curriculum be for it? You kind of mentioned a few things, but you're talking about personal finance, which is really important, especially what you take for granted is like even MBAs don't know everything about personal finance, right? But you probably know a lot more than someone who hasn't gone to business school about finance, given that you've taken some classes. Personal finance is specific; it's different, right, than like LBO finance, for example. But that's interesting. Personal finance. I think like for me, there was a class called Authentic Leadership Development, which was very much, I think, the most like personal development focused course at HBS, at least during my time there, where it helped you develop, I think, a self awareness, understanding, trying to figure out where your blind spots are, and just trying to, I think, overall, just the class elevated my EQ quite a bit, just connecting with other classmates in that format. Very personal class. That would be a good thing to like weave into this like CEO of self curriculum, if you will. And then you mentioned relationships. Can you share more about that, Hassan? Like what you mean by that?
Um, yes. So by relationships, I mean that at the end of the day, when you're in the HBS bubble, or you will notice that everyone, all the recruiters come to you for hiring you, for interviewing you, and so you don't have to really search for a job. But the tables turn post MBA when I think the something like the statistic is that MBA students, specifically HBS at least, they tend to switch 7 to 8 times in their career, switch companies. And so to that extent, and that's post MBA 7 to 8 times, I believe. And so to the extent that you can actually form relationships where it will dramatically help you in terms of your career, because at the end of the day, no longer will companies come to a specific area and be able to and want to recruit you. You will have to look for your next role, your next company through relationships. That's where it will matter the most. And it is those relationships that will both influence your thoughts in terms of the risks that you take, to perhaps the direction that you go. But more importantly, it's those relationships that will dramatically help you as you go through the ups and downs of your career.
Yeah, that reminds me of something you touched on earlier, just like how like your, I guess, your close relationships in business school, and then you have like, more I guess loose connections is like the academic term for it, and then probably acquaintances. I'm not sure what the order is, but or what the nomenclature is. But yeah, I think from my experience, like, speaking of relationships and on that topic, it's business school. You're just the proximity just fosters such deep relationships with many people. Then a couple years outside of business school, this is my experience. I'm curious what yours was. You kind of hold on to a kind of dozens of relationships. Maybe, like you mentioned the number 20. That feels about right. A lot of it's through weddings. These
Right.
people around that age are getting married. And so weddings almost become like mini business school reunions of sorts. You're all going to a destination and you're meeting up there. Those are really nice. Then that time passes quickly. And then it's like, at least from my experience, people start having kids, families, they get deeper into their careers, more responsibility at work and at home, and it just becomes there's fewer opportunities that are created for you to stay connected with people. So it does kind of like that level of connection changes over time. That's been my experience. I don't know if that you're nodding your head, so I feel like it might be something similar to that.
That's exactly right. It just, life gets much more complicated, busier. And as a result, that pool of friends that you keep in touch with just narrows and narrows. And so you want to be able to have friends that you could always count on in the good times and the bad, and friends that will always pick up the phone and or respond to an email whenever you need help.
Yeah. And I got two questions. I ask everyone these questions, but two final questions here. Thank you so much again for your time here. This is a
Sure.
tough one. I don't know how you're gonna go about it, but I'm interested with your engineering brain how you approach this. But I'm asking everyone, what is the ROI on your MBA?
That's a interesting question. So I do think that, frankly, if someone knows exactly what they want to do and has a good sense of purpose and direction, MBA would be less helpful in the sense of you should just go do it. Those 2 years are may or may not help you, but if you know what your interest is and you have a good sense of direction, then just focus on it. And frankly, I wouldn't recommend it. For those that are seeking crave more sort of power, authority, more leadership, and or the curriculum of the education, then I think there is certainly a high ROI, in particular if you focus on sort of your top 5 MBA programs. And as I mentioned, use that time to focus on what your interests are, and start establishing roots in or trial and error. But I believe the ROI has diminished since you and I went to school 10 years ago or so. And that's simply because of the fact that I believe that there's just so many other avenues to proliferate in terms of your career, as opposed to Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000. When the pool of possibilities have dramatically, I believe, increased. And as a result, back in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, it used to be obviously Fortune 500, Fortune 1000. And now it's dramatically different in terms of all the different types of tech companies in a variety of industries. And so you could argue that the ROI is diminished from that aspect. But at the end of the day, I do think it can be extremely valuable for those that want to explore and use that opportunity to form their relationships and iterate on their hypotheses or certain passions that they think that they would like.
Awesome. Very interesting answer. Yeah, I didn't think about how it's changed over time. That's an interesting thing to think about. Yeah. All right. Final question here, I think, but this is for my benefit. So I'm curious.
Sure.
I finished HBS in 2016, so I'm like 8 years out, 2 years away from 10 years, which is marked by a milestone with the 10-year reunion, which I'm very much looking forward to. But I'm curious from your experience, how did you feel 5 years post MBA and 10 years post MBA? Any different? How have things changed for you?
My experience has been, 5 years post MBA, everyone's still sizing each other up, and they're still sort of, they still, I feel, have that ego of trying to make it big, and perhaps reality hasn't set in quite, and so they're sort of, I think the ego is still very much prevalent 5 years. After the 10-year mark, I believe that ego and sort of image and perception becomes less visible. People are more comfortable with who they are, where they are, and as a result, they don't necessarily try to sell themselves or market themselves. I think they're just more comfortable. And as I've heard in speaking with other alumni, that actually, ego decreases and comfort in who you are and being sort of more authentic increases as you grow older. And so, and perhaps that just comes with age, but I do think that also comes with, going through life, where perhaps up until business school, you've never had any setbacks. Perhaps just post business school, you've never had any setbacks. And folks that are 10 years past will have realized that their career trajectory is not going to go like this, like a hockey stick all the time. It will have ups and downs. They will have their own challenges. Life is not going to go exactly the way that they planned. And it's those experiences that I think make a person incredibly humble and and frankly break them down and build them up to understand not only themselves but be more comfortable in their own skin. And it's at that point that you really have to it's at those pivotal points where you truly know who you are and who those that are closest to you are. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, there's definitely a distinction there. 5-10 years out, I'm excited to reconnect in 5 more years, and you can give me the 15-year answer.
Happy to.
Yeah, I guess before we wrap up, is there anything else, Ehsan, that you'd like to share Any parting advice, parting words here?
Yeah, good question. I would say a few things. One is oftentimes I feel that especially at HBS, it's such a. I'll say it like this. I went on a trek one time to East Africa with HBS, and the group leader, it was a tour guide, I believe, was a guide for all the top 10 MBA curriculums that went to tour through East Africa. And he said that I've done this for so many years, I can tell without anybody mentioning that they're from HBS, I can tell that they're from HBS. And I said, how's that? He said, all the other programs, you'll see that the group of 50 will get together and they're willing to follow each other in terms of if certain people wanted to do certain things, they would just break up into 2 or 3 groups and they would just sort of compromise and follow each other. Then he said, with HBS, generally speaking, folks are not willing to compromise, and the groups will not be just 2 or 3. It'll be 10 to 20 different, because people will not willing to compromise and they'll just simply do their own thing, which is certainly a good thing. It could be good. It could be viewed as good and bad. The good part is I find it that it's important to have the courage to choose how you want to spend your time. But also, I think it's important to look back and help others that are around you. Be flexible, have fun, frankly, in that experience. Be willing to mentor and develop those that are, 5, 10 years your junior. I think at the end of the day, you may enjoy that flashy car or that flashy job or that flashy title for the first month or 2, but it's the relationships and the impact that you've made on people's lives. And frankly, it's the people that remember your name and your legacy that I believe matter the most in your life. And if you view the world through that lens, then relationships and legacy in your authenticity are perhaps the most important things that you should consider in terms of making a lasting impact.
I think that's a great way to wrap this. I don't think there's a better way to wrap up this conversation than that. Very great, thoughtful piece of advice. Yeah, Ehsan, thank you so much for doing this. I think a lot of people are going to find this conversation very helpful to their journeys.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Mike, and look forward to hopefully continuing this conversation, as you say, in my 15th year reunion.
I'll hold you to that.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.